Very good evening and thank you for joining us. This is a special Saturday edition of Live with Faye. We will have an AMA, but we'll have it immediately after this conversation is over because it's a really important conversation. And I'm so happy that this is the time that our guest gave us, so we've decided to have the conversation at this time. We've had so much go on with the attacks in France and the reactions to those attacks and to the comments made by the French president from across the world. This is our attempt to understand what is going on the global stage better. And I'm very proud to introduce my guest for this evening. Suhasini Haidar is the diplomatic editor of The Hindu. She writes on foreign policy issues. Before this, she was foreign affairs editor at CNN-IBN, and she is a multi-award-winning journalist. She's covered foreign policy for over a decade, and she's been kind enough to make time for us here to explain to us what's going on the global stage, and of course, India's part in all of that. Ms. Haidar, good evening, and thank you for joining us. Thank you for giving me your time. I'm sure our audience has kept track of what's happening, but just today's update for them. We've, according to reports, and I'm reading a report from Al Jazeera that says tens of thousands of Muslims across the world, from Pakistan, Bangladesh, Palestine, poured out onto protests after Friday prayers against French president's promise to protect the right of caricature of the Prophet Muhammad. And apparently there were about 40,000 people in Bangladesh that marched in the capital of Dhaka. There have been calls for him to apologize. There have been calls by heads of state to boycott French products. And this is actually, it set everybody on edge because everyone's trying to understand what this means. And my first question to you is simply this. Is this now, if, a sort of watershed moment in global politics? Is there a new bloc that is being formed in the world?
Faye, it's always hard, and thank you for accommodating me on the show at this time. It's always hard to decide what is going to be the watershed moment. After all, it was 2012, the watershed moment when that film came out, which depicted the Prophet in court. And there were protests in which the US ambassador to Libya was killed, but there were protests around the world. Was 2015 a watershed moment when Charlie Hebdo brought out those cartoons and 12 of their staff members were killed in a terror attack that followed. And is 2020 that watershed moment? I think there is no question that where religious feelings are upset, and they are upset in different religions in different parts of the world at different times, these become a sort of almost an excuse or a trigger for terror groups or for people who are criminally minded to carry out criminal acts. So what tends to happen is that one obviously has set off the other, and we are seeing protests around the world, particularly in the Islamic world over this. We have seen actually in an interesting turn, countries officially making statements about France, which perhaps we have not seen quite so much in the past, because in the past there's been a movement in the world towards kind of trying to find consensus and trying to work these things out. Even the last time we heard of this kind of ban on a boycott of French goods, for example, was perhaps in 2003, when the American population was very incensed because France refused to take part in the war against Iraq. And if you remember, there was a large-scale ban on a boycott of French products. Americans actually renamed French fries as freedom fries. But we didn't see it as an official state policy. Here you have the Turkish president make it an official state policy. You have him saying things like the French president needs mental treatment. I think some of it is definitely a reaction to the French president's own comments, where he extrapolated from these very criminal acts, horrific acts, of beheading, one in a Paris suburb and then in Nice. But he extrapolated from that and spoke about the need for reform in the religion. He spoke about radicalism around the world. So some of it was that he internationalized, in a sense, the events that had happened inside France, and which essentially are an outcome of France's domestic politics, or a part of France's domestic politics. And now there is what you were saying, you know, the global impact, the international impact. I also want to say very quickly, Faye, that there are three parts to this. And anyone who thinks that it's just about hurt feelings or just about terrorism or just about radicalism should consider that many of these things are, in a cynical sense, also about international politics. France and Turkey have been at loggerheads on a range of issues, particularly over Turkey's original hopes that it would join NATO. France and Turkey have also been, of course, on loggerheads over this particular issue of cartoons from 2015 and the Charlie Hebdo matter. There is a push in Turkey for the leadership of the Islamic world. Turkey is positioning itself, in a sense, versus countries like Saudi Arabia, UAE, Gulf countries that have traditionally held the leadership of the Islamic world. And Turkey, in consonance with countries like Pakistan at times and countries like Iran, Malaysia, has in fact tried to position itself as a leader of the Islamic world, if you like. And then there is a factor of France's own domestic politics and the internal fissures and internal problems that they are having. At the same time, as Mr. Macron said, that France's government tries to hold on to its very, very key secularism policy.
If I may ask you, please, for the benefit of my audience, France practices a kind of secularism or interprets secularism perhaps differently from other countries. It's also important to remind our audience here that while the average European country has a Muslim population of less than 5%, France's Muslim population is higher than that. It's closer, from what I understand, to 9%. And in October this year, Mr. Macron outlined a law that they're going to bring in, which his government plans to introduce to regulate the practice of Islam in France. So this would actually form the background of everything we've seen play out over the last 2 weeks. Would you take us through that background, please?
No, it is a very important thing because, of course, this law has set off all kinds of concerns as well. And as you pointed out, France has a higher percentage of Muslims. Many of those are actually immigrants from countries where France had been a colonial power. And has an old relationship or an old power structure inside. You asked me about France's secularism policy, what is called laïcité, or of the people. This is more than, I think, 2 centuries old now in terms of France's decision to become a secular republic. And you're quite right that France practices it very differently from other pluralistic countries, in the sense you've had in India, for example, where there is a kind of complete mixing of cultures and religions, and aren't really very strong frameworks when it comes to expression of religion. You have something like the United Kingdom that followed for a long time the policy of multiculturalism, which often meant that if a religion was in a majority in a particular area, they actually got to choose even over what was the state's policy. Now, France has been very specific. External symbols of religion have been out. In fact, it might surprise you to know that originally laïcité was brought in to try and divide the church, or the Catholic Church, from the state, and to take out. So even things like crosses, to wear a cross in a French public school is not allowed. You might remember that a few years ago, there was a huge controversy about the fact that India requested the French president to allow Sikhs to wear turbans in public institutions, because Sikhs were not allowed to wear turbans in public institutions. So that has been the basis, the bedrock, if you like, of France's secularism policy, which is essentially to put religion in a personal box and to defend not just the freedom of religion across religion, but to defend the freedom of speech, which is why if you hear Mr. Macron's speech where he actually defends blasphemy, to other countries, it may seem like a controversial position, but the French have been very clear that this is their policy, that essentially the right to offend is part of the freedom of speech over there. And the push, if you like, to, you had spoken about the new law, is essentially with the idea that the law must take into account that there is this belief that there is now this radicalism, And remember, France has been affected much more by ISIS as well. We saw that that ISIS attack some years ago across the city of Paris. That there is a belief that these principles of secularism have to be tightened, if you like, have to be reaffirmed, if you like, in order to ensure that external expressions of religion are not allowed. France does things perhaps that you wouldn't see in other countries, if you remember. Sorry, go ahead.
No, so my question, and this is a question popping up from some of our viewers as well. If the system is 2 centuries old and it was meant to visibly separate the Catholic Church from state, and thereby all religions from those in government, what is the need for a new law now? And does that law specifically look at one religion?
Well, let's be clear. Every country decides laws on the basis of its own political scenario. There have been many debates inside France about the use of the headscarf. Should a veil be allowed? What kind of veil should be allowed? Because after all, French women in the countryside do cover their hair. You have people of other religions, like Catholic nuns, for example, who do cover their hair. How much of the face should be seen? These have been issues of very, very critical debate inside France. And as I said, this idea of laicite, if you like, is very integral to the French secularist cause. I do want to add that there is now a real worry about law and order as well. And France, if you will notice, of course, they had these massive attacks as well by ISIS, and a bomb and a truck bomb as well. But France has seen a larger number of what are called lone wolf attacks. The idea that people who are radicalized, are incensed, and are attacking innocent, civilians because of this sense of outrage, what is essentially lone wolf, is being seen more in France perhaps than other countries of Europe. And there is a reaction to that as well. Elections in France are in 2022. Mr. Macron has always been juxtaposed against the right-wing Marine Le Pen's criticism of him in the opposition has always been about the left wing being too liberal, too soft on this kind of radicalization. And clearly, all of these will play a part as the government decides its policy on this new law.
We must also talk about India's reaction and the reaction of our Ministry of External Affairs. Is it unusual for our ministry to have come out so quickly, so strongly in support of France, or is that something that was expected?
There are 2 or 3 parts to this. The first is that France has been an unequivocal supporter of India, regardless of internal problems, external problems, and otherwise. France has always backed India. There is a sense in this government particularly that the relationship is very strong. The attack that happened in a Parisian suburb and then followed by the attacks in Nice happened even as the Foreign Secretary Harsh Shringla was flying to Paris. This is his first visit outside of the neighborhood because of the coronavirus pandemic. So what we're essentially seeing is that the government was making that statement in order to let the French people know that, or the French government know that India stands with France. But what was interesting about the statement, and when you asked if it was unusual, it was certainly unusual in 2 parts. One, that it said very clearly that it criticized the statements made, which were personal statements, about Mr. Macron. The statement made by Mr. Erdogan, for example, about Mr. Macron needing mental treatment is excessively personal. So when you ask me if it's unusual for India to react this way, I will say these are unusual times when heads of state speak in this language about each other. So India made a personal gesture, in a sense, to Mr. Macron. And if you notice, Prime Minister Modi also tweeted about the attack in Nice. The second part of the MEA's statement was essentially to decry and condemn the terror act. And I think India has been at the forefront of condemning acts of terror. So that part is not as unusual.
Well, speaking of the fact that heads of state are making unusual statements, there is, of course, a statement that came from the head of state of Malaysia, which Twitter had to take down, which I don't think has ever happened before, or maybe Donald Trump has come fairly close to that line in the past, where Twitter had to take it down because it didn't meet the Twitter standards. He then, of course, made a statement saying that it was taken out of context. But if we were to step back and look at the world right now, look at maybe Chinese diplomacy, is there perhaps a change of gear in diplomacy across the world? It's become more Twitter-led. The statements are maybe perhaps less measured than they used to be.
Oh, absolutely. And, the comment that was made by the former Prime Minister of Malaysia is horrific, because he's specifically suggesting that violence against the French population was justified, and speaks about, I don't want to repeat the words because now the tweet has been taken down, but it was, it fit all the measures for a hate tweet, and eventually has been deleted. But you're quite right that this kind of incendiary commentary that now we are seeing from heads of states themselves is now a part of our discourse. We are dealing with it. It is a consequence, perhaps, of the kind of populism that is holding sway around the world. We've heard similar strong statements, not similar, but strong statements coming from Pakistan, coming from Malaysia, from Turkey against France, when in fact it should be possible to be disappointed by some of what Mr. Macron said for these countries, while making a very strong case against any act of terror, any criminal act. Whereas what we're seeing instead is a kind of competitive populism, if you like, around the world, where each one is actually speaking to their own domestic constituency, and foreign policy and international diplomacy is definitely, as you were pointing out, taking a backseat to that.
Incidentally, though, enough has been written about, maybe not enough, but a considerable amount of coverage has happened over the detention camps that China has, where they're specifically targeting Muslim population within China in horrific conditions. Why have Muslim Islamic countries not come out in the same way against China?
Look, that is a question that each country has to answer. Let's remember that even India has made no statement about the Uyghur camps in particular, despite India's other bilateral issues with China. Some of it, of course, has to do with the fact that the countries hesitate to speak about the internal issues of another country without there being a United Nations or other multilateral backing to it. But you're quite right that the Islamic world is, by and large, the Organization of Islamic Countries, is by and large turned a blind eye to evidence that is coming out of China of what is happening inside Xinjiang. Now, everybody does want to be careful. You don't want to necessarily go along with the United States that makes its statements on the basis of its own policies. Because after all, until maybe a year or two ago, the United States didn't have a problem with China either, and didn't speak as much as they do now on these issues. But each country has to make that decision. I think many have now called out specifically countries like Pakistan, for example, that makes so many public statements about Kashmir and the treatment of people inside Kashmir, but goes completely silent when it comes to the Uyghur population, about the stories of the camps inside Xinjiang, the fact that people are not allowed to profess their religion freely, that children are taken away from their homes for re-education, that parents are taken away, that even things like religious practices are seen as a cause for detentions. People who go to pray more than once or twice a week are called it. So all of this evidence that has come out, they have not spoken about. I think recently we had the Pakistani national security advisor to the Prime Minister being asked, and he very clearly said that we don't see a problem over there. So there is definitely a double standard, and you're quite right about that, Faye.
Ask you about these lone attacks, and one could argue quite rightly being termed terror attacks. If this is the new form of terrorism, how will countries protect their citizens from this kind of terror? Because we understand, anti-terror policing and anti-terror security looks for sleeper cells. They make sure that ammunition and guns are not brought into our borders. But if we're looking, I mean, are we going to have to police individual citizens with kitchen knives, with knives? Because these terror attacks will then be very difficult to prevent. And this we saw happen a couple of years ago again in France on Bastille Day, when one individual drove a truck through a crowd. Again, something that the police can't foresee. And just to list out what that new law that Macron is working on, and I'm reading out of The Guardian. It says measures include placing mosques in France under greater control, requiring imams to be trained and certified by France. The aim is to, he has said, liberate French Islam from foreign influences and funding. And Islamic organizations that receive funding from the French state will have to sign a secular charter. Do we expect now the French government to perhaps extend this to even more surveillance? How are they going to, what is this going to result in? What kind of surveillance is it going to result in?
You're asking a question that has eluded, the answer of which has eluded countries around the world, because there are very few countries that have not in some way or form faced the threat of terrorism. And terrorism essentially in that broad sense, being an attack on civilians intended to engender fear or engender a kind of larger impact, if you like, than if you were to go and target a military, target or an official target, if you like. So these are what are broadly called as lone wolf attacks. And you're quite right that France has to find new ways to grapple with it. I don't know if their law is actually the answer. The US has had lone wolf attacks. If you remember in Las Vegas, the man who just opened, sniper fire onto a concert. There are many ways of trying to restrict this. If you ask me, one of the common trends that lone wolves want to benefit from is the idea that they will be generalized. That essentially one person who goes out there, makes a religious statement, gives a religious slogan, is then seen as a representative of the larger religion. And I think that's where countries do have to make the distinction that while they are condemning the criminal act, what they are trying to do is to stop the criminal act. They are not trying to stop the religion, and they are not trying to paint, if you like, an entire community with a brush that has been bloodied by one person or two people or a few people. That is a constant fight. And let me tell you, when you do end up blaming an entire community, actually it is the extremists that win. There are small counterpoints that you could point out in this case of France, where Mr. Macron has said that the religion needs a reform and that there is Islamism crisis around the world. One always has to remember that that a lot of the attacks that are carried out by these so-called Islamist groups are actually in Islamic countries.
Yes.
I have figures from the global terrorism database that was maintained in the US of 81 terror attacks in which more than 100 people were killed. So this is the high casualty rate since 2001. Of those 81 terror attacks, 70 were actually carried out in Islamic or Muslim majority countries. Places like Iraq, places like Iran, places that we have seen in Syria. Places that are essentially Islamic countries. A lot of these attacks, especially if you remember those big bomb blasts in Baghdad and in Mosul, are essentially on mosques. So the idea that this pan-Islamism is behind a kind of a terror is essentially buying into the ideology of an ISIS or an Al-Qaeda, which wants to make pan-religionism more important than what is happening in one particular country. And at the end of the day, France, like every other country, is going to have to deal with terrorism inside their country. There is enough data now to show that in India, for example, pan-Islamic groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda have actually not made any impact at all. That essentially we are dealing with cross-border terrorism. And while there have been a few cases of Indians joining some of these pan-religion groups, we don't actually have numbers that are even statistically verifiable when it comes to these groups. And you compare a country like India, which has its pluralistic population, which has so many minorities, to countries like Europe, where in fact they have lower populations, but they do see a larger proportion, if you like, joining these pan-Islamic groups. So I think there are so many threads to all of this that have to be pulled apart. I don't think anyone has the right answer, but eventually, if we are going to be multi-religious, ethnic and pluralistic societies around the world, and given migration that is going to grow, then the whole world does have to come to some kind of an accepted common ground when it comes to A, dealing with all these different identities, but B, dealing with terror itself. I mean, the fact is that the world has not come together to fight terror, except when you see something like the US's global war on terror. India has for years pushed to have something called the Comprehensive Convention on International Terrorism, passed by the United Nations since 1996, actually, and has not made headway even with some of these very, westernized nations.
Well, you did say yourself that most countries and most responses are also with one eye constantly on their internal elections. Whenever that internal election is, we're seeing an election play out in the US that I know that you're tracking. And I just want to point out this one thing. So in the US, whenever there is a mass shooting, they call it a mass shooting, and the perpetrator of the crime is a white man, they call this a mass shooting by a very disturbed individual. They don't call it terrorism. Are we, because of the way things are playing out, likely to see now the world divide itself even further on the lines of religion, on the lines of these sort of, because of political interest more than anything else, rather than coming together, like you said, if the enemy is terrorism and not a religion, they should actually be able to come together and find a way to fight together.
And the reason they don't, Faye, is because eventually nations have been divided. Nation states that exist in the world today do put national interest first. So when you have a situation where Israel today is seen as closer to countries like Saudi Arabia, like the UAE, than it is to, than Turkey is to these countries, if you like, what are we essentially seeing here? We're seeing politics that is innate to each country playing out. It is not about these pan-world ideologies, essentially. Those may be used by different politicians, but at the end of the day, each country has to look to its own interests, if you like, which have nothing to do necessarily. I mean, India has great relations with a whole swathe of countries of different religions, of different ethnicities, and even of different government systems.
Yes.
If you have a theocracy as well, we have been able to deal with them. This is not to say that, this is the only way to do things. It is to say that just as we have a plethora of identities inside our countries, we also deal with them outside the country. So I do take your point, and I know I'm giving a very broad-based answer to it. But essentially, so much of what we see is political. Two countries, I mean, until a few decades ago, perhaps, we were talking about Turkey as the great hope of the Western world. Mr. Erdogan was going to be the great reformer around the world. So that clearly changed. There was even talk about him possibly joining the European Union, forget NATO. So you have these political issues that change countries. Politicians come to power and change the ideologies, if you like, of a country. But essentially, what we are dealing with in the world is a coalition of nation states, not a coalition of religions.
Okay. Suhasini, Haidar, I know that you gave us more time than you had agreed to, so thank you for that, and thank you for answering our questions here. Suhasini, Haidar, the global policy editor of the diplomatic editor of the Hindu, there, answering questions on what's going on in France and the rest of the world.
Thanks so much, Faye, and have a good evening.